Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study, coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are, as most of you know, working through week by week the books of the Pentateuch, following fairly closely according to the annual cycle of readings of the five, the Pentateuch. In fact, the name of our current study is called The Pentateuch, A New Look. We're in class number 33, boys and girls. We've been going at this quite a while. We still have a good bit to go, and I'm excited about today's class. We're in, as you know, the book of Numbers, according to the way we call it in much of the world, because of the Greek. The Greek of the book, the Greek title is arithmoi. As we talked about last week, it's primarily because when you open the book of Numbers, you find a lot of numbers, so it's appropriately called in that sense. But technically and biblically and Hebraically, the book is called Bamidbar. Bamidbar means in the wilderness. But, and though it is obvious, I assume, to most of you, the children of Israel, per our narrative sources, have been in the wilderness. They didn't just get in the wilderness. When we turn the page from the last verse of Leviticus to the book of Numbers, they've been in the wilderness. And according to our sources, the children of Israel spend approximately 40 years in that wilderness, in the wilderness. I should say wildernesses, because we have multiple wildernesses that are described in what I have called the wilderness wanderings. So basically, from the time that the children of Israel leave Egypt in Exodus chapter 13 all the way until they enter the land under the leadership of Joshua, you can say that they are in the wilderness. Now, what may not be as obvious, though I admit some of you probably know this, if you don't know it or if you thought you knew it, you'll know it more hopefully by the end of the day today of my class, because what a lot of people don't see, or what may not be so obvious, is that within the books of the Pentateuch, quite often, particularly within the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, these stories, or there are stories, I should say, that are told in more than one book. In other words, more than one book might contain a certain story that's repeated or told differently in another book of the Pentateuch. Now, even this point doesn't necessarily go unnoticed by many of you. Of that I am certain. However, I think that few hardly recognize or notice the degree to which this occurs in the Pentateuch. In other words, I'm suggesting that this occurs at a much more frequent rate than you might think. Now, a lot of times people don't notice it because they assume that it's a different story altogether. Because it occurred in another place, they think that it is a different story. We're going to look at that today, and we're going to challenge that. Now, that view that people have, that a lot of times they think, well, it's another story altogether, that's understandable, and let me tell you why. It's understandable because most of us grow up learning to read the books consecutively: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, in that order, often taking quite a time to do it. And therefore, when we get to a story, which I'm going to propose is the same story you may have read before, people would think, well, it occurs later, it's in another book, it's another story, it just happens to have some similar points. We're going to look at that very closely. But people generally read the Bible, particularly the Pentateuch, book by book, in the order in which they are presented to us in our Bibles. Now, this is regrettable. It's regrettable because that mentality, that understanding deprives us of something quite instructive, something quite informative. And it means that if we read it in that way and that way only, and we never do what I'm about to begin to do today, I've done it in previous classes, but I'm really going to bring this to the fore in today's class. When we don't read these side by side, the accounts juxtaposed one with the other, we miss some things. We miss some similarities. We miss some differences between these sources. And I think that, again, that's just regrettable. The material in our sources that make up the Pentateuch, I'm going to state this very plainly up front so there's no ambiguity, are often told and retold, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times. And at times, the details vary between one telling and another telling. Now, what this has caused over the centuries, scholars and sages have pondered and written and entertained, looking for, searching for, seeking for reasons for these repetitions. Now, one example of a solution is what the academics have come up with, and I'm going to go into this a little bit, not in today's class, but I just want to let you know, some people have totally dismissed out of hand what scholars have come up with in terms of understanding the composition of the Pentateuch. They say, because they don't really understand what scholars have come up with, they totally dismiss out of hand all of the work that came to lead scholars to believe that the Pentateuch as we have it is composed of 4 sources. Now, there are arguments for and against, I admit that. What I'm doing is not that at all. I am not presenting to you the standard academic view. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the sources, I'm looking at the text itself, and I'm seeing and presenting to you, showing to you some of the things that caused the scholars to come up with that. In other words, we're looking at the root cause of what led scholars to try to understand and interpret why we have 2 accounts of a particular story. In other words, they looked at a story and they said, oh, that story is told here. Oh, and it's also told here. And when I look at them side by side, there are certain distinctive characteristics about each of these stories. They seem to be telling the same story, but they vary in detail. Therefore, they begin to identify what they considered the source of each of these. Now, I know that this does not agree with the traditional understanding that Moses wrote the 5 books. But what we're going to do is we're putting all traditional views just to the side respectfully. We're putting all the academics to the side respectfully. And we're saying, let's go to the source. Let's go to the text itself. And let's see if there really are various sources which tell the same story. And this is an excellent opportunity for us to begin to really delve into this topic, and I want to do that today. Now, one of the most obvious, or I should say the best known case where most people, even fundamentalists, believe that we have 2 accounts of the same story in our Pentateuch. And I would classify this, let me just put it this way. Many people believe that the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy is just a repetition of what we've read elsewhere. Go with me to Deuteronomy 17, Deuteronomy chapter 17. I want to kick off with this verse this morning. Deuteronomy 17, verse 18. This comes from a pericope that is about the king, a Torah of the king. And it begins in chapter 17, verse 14, and it runs all the way through verse 20. But I just want to read verse 18. It says, when he, meaning the monarch, is seated on his royal throne, I'm reading from the JPS, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priest. Now, what in the world does that have to do with our subject? Well, the name Deuteronomy is typically translated as a second law, and the name of that book was given the name Deuteronomy because of this verse, Deuteronomy 17:18. In Hebrew it says Mishneh HaTorah, that the king, the monarch would have a copy of HaTorah Hazot, this Torah written for him. Now, on a fundamentalist level, both Jews and Christians often put this idea out to the people who follow their particular faith, that Deuteronomy really tells us not a lot new, that it's Moses' recollection of events that took place in Exodus, particularly Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But I have to tell you very frankly that this view is incorrect. Deuteronomy is not a retelling. It's not fair to call it simply a retelling of events that took place previously in the other books of the Pentateuch. In fact, this view that Deuteronomy is merely a copy does a great disservice to the nature of the book. It fails to recognize, it fails to explain some very important points, some key points, such as, if Deuteronomy is only a copy of what we've learned before, help me understand this. Why is it that Deuteronomy contains more than 100 laws, I'm using laws in a generic sense, that are known nowhere else in the Pentateuch? Deuteronomy is not copying certain laws from other books because they're not present in other books to the number of about 100. There are major differences, or if your faith precludes you from saying major differences, you can just say differences. But there are differences between certain accounts which are presented in the book of Deuteronomy and the same account that is told to us in another place. So it's not just a retelling of the same event. The events are being described differently. And that is a fact. Even the 10 words, the 10-word covenant, the testimony as it's referred to in some of our sources, the 10 words written on 2 tablets of stone are presented to us in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, and they read differently. They read differently not just in an English translation, but in the Hebrew, and these purport to be the words of God spoken on the day of assembly from the midst of the fire and later engraved on stone. Now, another question that needs to be answered and that puts aside this idea that Deuteronomy is simply a retelling of things we've read elsewhere is that Deuteronomy is the only book of our Pentateuch which contains first-person narration, presumably by Moses. You won't find it in Exodus. You won't find it in Leviticus. You won't find it in Numbers. And you don't even find it all the time in Deuteronomy. But you do find it in Deuteronomy, and only in Deuteronomy. But all of these questions aren't answered if we simply suggest that Deuteronomy is a late product that's just simply a retelling of previous things. In fact, the academic world would even go so far, and they have gone so far, many have suggested that Deuteronomy is called a pious fraud, that it wasn't discovered in the days of Josiah, but it was written in the days of Josiah to substantiate the reform of Josiah. Interestingly enough, the book of Deuteronomy tends to match more closely, in fact, almost exclusively, the description of the Torah of Moses, which is discovered in the days of Josiah by Hilkiah the high priest. That story is in the book of Kings and 2 Kings 22 and 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35. Now, of course, there are some people who prefer to explain away any and all perceived different details. That's a fact. And maybe some of you are in that camp where you simply try to conflate, you simply try to bring together these differences and just ignore them or hope they go away or make them go away. Admittedly, this is a more popular method. It's a whole lot easier to say, well, there are no differences whatsoever. They're just perceived differences, is what some would say. And that is a lot more popular. In other words, when people look for a place to hang their faith hat, if they look for a place to associate with, a lot of times they prefer to go with this easy path that just says there are no difficulties. Well, I put my hat there for many years, but what I'm more confident in now is to trust the text. Some believe that they're supposed to dismiss any differences. Some believe that that's a holy and a righteous thing to do. They believe that those who do otherwise are somehow less faithful, less holy, less sanctified, however you want to put it. These people who ignore difficulties or variations between our accounts often believe that they are defending the text, that they're defending the text, perhaps defending the faith, and some even believe that they're defending the truth and defending God. But I say, trust the text. You see, I started this whole journey years and years ago as someone who took this book and said, I'm going to know the words that are contained. I'm going to study the words of this book. And that led me to this particular place. You've heard people talk about liberal versus conservative, critical versus faithful. Some people believe that a liberal person who is critical of the text, who looks for these variations, is somehow on the wrong side of history, as it were. Whereas someone who defends that there are no difficulties, who ignores them, is somehow the conservative. But I've said this before, I'll say it again this morning. I'm the conservative here. I'm the one who's looking at the text, and if you do it with me, you are too. So don't be nervous. Don't be worried. We're reading the text and we're trusting what the text says to give us some revelation here, to give us insight, to give us information. Today, I want to share some of my observations based on some of the stories from the wilderness wanderings. Now, I've called this class a Synoptic Synopsis. I'm obviously playing on alliteration, the similar sound of synoptic, synopsis, and I think I'm using these terms fairly accurately. But let me tell you my understanding of what I'm looking at when I call this a Synoptic Synopsis. By synoptic, I mean to utilize the literal meaning of that word, which means to be seen together, to be viewed together. And by synopsis, I'm using the typical understanding of that word, which is a summary. So we're looking at things together and we're providing a summary of, you guessed it, some of the stories from the wilderness wanderings. Now, I've produced a document. I've produced a document that is 24 pages in length, and it's a table. It is a table where I have juxtaposed various text stories that I find to be represented in more than one book of the Pentateuch, and we're going to look at these. We're not going to look at it in 24-page detail where I have to read everything to you. I'm going to allow you to read some to yourself as a later Sabbath day study, but I'm going to hit some high points. Now, what I want to do by way of introducing this document is give you a little bit of background on how I came to produce it and what it's going to show you, and then I'll show you that it shows you what I think it's going to show you. So if that made any sense, I made this point in last week's class. The Torah reading, the Pentateuch reading that we were in, according to the normal cycle of readings, contained in chapter 10 of the book of Numbers the departure of the children of Israel from the Sinai or Horeb region, Numbers chapter 10. And the reason that I'm going to start here with my story is that I told you at the end of last week's class that Numbers 10 says that the children of Israel at a certain time departed from Horeb Sinai. Now, I also pointed out that interestingly enough, it's that very story that Deuteronomy begins with. Deuteronomy begins with the children of Israel being at Horeb and God telling Moses, "You've been at this mountain long enough. Turn and go." Paraphrasing. So if we have in Numbers chapter 10 a story of the children of Israel departing, and we have that story kicking off the book of Deuteronomy, it stands to reason that we might assume that what follows may also line up with the book of Numbers. Imagine that. What if Numbers chapter 10, which describes the departure from Horeb Sinai, Deuteronomy chapter 1 describes the departure of children of Israel from Horeb Sinai, what if what follows goes in that same pattern? What if I found something in Numbers chapter 11 that concurred with or aligned with or told the same story as something which followed the opening of Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 6 and following? And I did. And we're going to look at it today. Numbers chapter 10 says that the move or the departure of the children of Israel from the Horeb Sinai region is prompted by a lifting of the cloud. A lifting of the cloud. So if you look at my handy chart, and I think my good friends have posted links to that so that you can get it. You see Dave Tyler is The Truth Matters. He posted it. Maybe others have. I just happened to look up, and right on cue, my dear friend and brother has posted this link. This is what it looks like. It's 24 pages, and it's titled Some Stories from the Wilderness Wanderings, a Synoptic Synopsis. Now, I'm not going to go point by point. I may not cover every point. In fact, there are many, many things that I could go into a great deal more detail. In fact, my master file has a notes column where I have my own personal notes, and it's much more detailed. But I don't want you to see that yet because it's still a work in progress, and I prefer to have something in fairly good order before I release it. But in general, this is a summary, and identified on this table are several stories that occur in more than one book of the Pentateuch. And remember, I'm starting with the departure from Horeb Sinai. I've actually done this for events that take place prior. That's the work that I'm spending a lot of time on in my spare time. But the reason I pulled this out, just so you know, is because this is the section of the Pentateuch that we're currently studying in the book of Bamidbar. So I have three columns: Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I'm trying my best to follow, for the most part, the sequence and arrangement, the order and arrangement of events according to the book of Bamidbar. And I'm looking to see if I have any similar stories, first of all, in other books of the Pentateuch, particularly Exodus and Deuteronomy. But even more than just looking for similar events, I'm also looking to see if those events follow in the same order. Because if they're just similar events, someone might be able to dismiss them and say, well, Ross, it sounds like the same event, but the details are so different, it's got to be another event. But if I begin to show you that these line up, that you have the departure from Horeb Sinai, and you have it in the book of Numbers, and you have it in the book of Deuteronomy, if around that, if what happens before and what happens after those two chapters lines up, then we're closer to I think, assessing and making the claim that these are the same story, but perhaps told differently by a different author. And by the way, I want to stress this again. I'm not preaching to you the academic view of the documentary hypothesis. I'm looking beyond that back at the sources which led them to come up with their solution. Okay? Let's leave it at that for right now. So I begin, before I begin this study, let me tell you the stories I'm going to look at. These are the stories that are covered in this document, and there are only a few. There are actually more, but these are the main ones. So here we are. These are the stories that are told in more than one source of our Pentateuch. You ready? Guidance of or by the cloud. So that's my first section we'll look at. The command to leave Horeb Sinai. The departure from Horeb Sinai. Missing Egypt's food. In other words, there are stories. Are there more than one story about the children of Israel missing food that they had in Egypt? Some say, of course, there are, Ross, but they're different accounts. Ha, ha, ha. Maybe not. And then how about the manna? What is it? What is the manna? What if the manna story happens to fall in the same order in a differently told story in different books of the Pentateuch? What if that were followed by a story about quail? Do we have more than one account of quail? Remember the quail? We're going to look at that. What about the burden of leadership? The burden of leadership. Do we have stories where in the Pentateuch that give varying details about this people is too heavy for me by Moses? Well, of course we do. Are they the same story or are they different? Well, we'll look at that. What about the spies narrative? Do we have more than one account of the sending of the quote-unquote spies? Well, sure we do. Are they the same account? Do they tell the same story with different details, or did he send two sets of spies? So in other words, if some of these events are the same event and they're told differently in different books of the Bible, we have to question, do they come from different sources? Did different authors pen these independent accounts? Or are we right if we're fundamentalist and we say, no, details may vary as they may, but it's one pen wrote the whole thing. Now, there are other sub-stories that play in as well. And I'll just give you one example. One example is when Jethro, Reuel, Hobab, departs, cuts leave of the children of Israel in the wilderness. Do we have more than one account of that? We sure do. Is it the same departure of Hobab, Reuel, Jethro? I'm going to propose that it is. In fact, especially when you see that it lines up with the order and arrangement of other stories both before and after. This is fun stuff. This is not comprehensive, meaning that there is more to this than I'm able to share today. I simply don't have time to go through everything in the Pentateuch in one day. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue this process. I've been introducing it slowly into the current series, and I'm going to continue to do that, and I'm going to continue to show you things, both similarities and differences in the text as we seek to identify sources as we work our way through. And by the way, I am presently working on a project which lays all of this out. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't think there's anything like this. I've had a few people send me, maybe this is it, maybe this is what you're looking for. But to date, none have done an adequate job of this. And here's what clued me into it. Now, I know some of you may not like this comparison, but if you take, in Christian studies, people take the four Gospels and they look at them side by side. It's called a harmony, often a harmony of the Synoptic Gospels, where Mark and Matthew and Luke are looked at side by side, and similarities are shown to be what they are, and differences are shown to be what they are. And what begins to come to the fore when you do this kind of study is you identify that certain authors use certain things that other authors didn't. One might rely heavily on trying to seek to prove his point by suggesting that this is a fulfillment of certain prophecies. Another might seem to be in a hurry and say, immediately Jesus left, etc. Whereas another might just say, and Jesus packed his bag and left. What I'm trying to do is take that same method. Now, again, some of you may say, well, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe the New Testament. Okay, be that as it may, the method where I'm approaching this is to look at text juxtaposed synoptically. If they're similar stories, let's look at them. The goal is to bring these stories together for a careful study. Shall we begin? And the world said, amen, let's go. Now, look at page 1. I begin with what I've titled Guidance by the Cloud. Guidance by the cloud. Now, if you notice in Exodus, I've got in that left-hand column, Exodus, the first block, I give plenty of examples before they even leave, before the tabernacle is set up, and we have a date for that, by the way, Exodus chapter 40, verse 1 and verse 17. Before the tabernacle is set up, when the children of Israel left the land of Egypt, we have the guidance of the cloud and pillar, right? We get this as early as Exodus 13. We see it in Exodus 14. We see it in Exodus 16. But particularly, I'm interested in the guidance of or by the cloud in terms of the departure from Sinai and Horeb, because it's from this point on that our study is going to get really intense, and you got to follow it very closely. So I want you to recognize that what I'm doing here is I just put those notes there so you get the idea, but look at the middle column that's headed Numbers. Notice 9:16. So it was always, Numbers chapter 9, verse 16, the cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. Now, some of you have seen these charts that I produce, but what you'll notice is where I find concurrence, I'll show those side by side. So for instance, back to the left-hand column, this is lacking in the Numbers version. It says, and I'm not going to do this all the way through, don't worry. I know you're thinking we have 24 pages of this. Exodus 40:36 says, throughout all their journeys. You see, that's not in the book of Numbers. It's not in the book of Deuteronomy in that order. So I just show it in Exodus. But look at the next part. Whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. Now, Numbers chapter 9, you see the column, verse 17. And whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, after that, the people of Israel would set out. You see the similarity there? Now, it's hard for me to imagine that this is taken, that this is not two separate descriptions of the same story. I mean, this is a given. I think everybody can say, yep, you got it. That's what it is. Now, notice how it's got one difference just to point it out. In Exodus, it says the Mishkan, whereas in Numbers, it says the Ohel, the tent. I just wanted you to see that there are similarities and differences. Now, the interesting thing about this, as we work through this, one of the things that you're going to see is that the accounts in Exodus chapter 40 and Numbers chapter 9, here's what they basically say. The author or the authors are making this point very clear. Listen, anytime the tabernacle moved, the cloud lifted, which signaled that it was time for the tabernacle to move. And whenever it would stop, they would set up camp. You never moved unless the pillar and the cloud moved. When the cloud moves, you move. When the cloud stays, you stay. That's what these verses say. And it says that it was like this throughout the whole wilderness experience. How long was the wilderness experience? 40 years, right? Roughly. But you realize that both of these accounts, it says, it even goes on in the book of Numbers to say, look, whether it was a day or a week or whatever, however long that cloud stayed there, the people didn't move. Now here's what I want you to realize. This story in Exodus 40 and Numbers chapter 9 is told, get this, understand this, before the tent ever moves the first time. That means that this text in both Exodus 40 and in the book of Numbers chapter 9 was inserted at a date at the earliest after the wilderness journeys are over. Does that make sense? You can't say, you can't go into all this detail about the whole of the wilderness journeys before the tent has ever moved the first time and see that as chronologically in the right place. It was written later. Who wrote it? Don't know. But it was inserted into this text to prepare the reader for what is to follow. And that's what is very important for us to understand. Now, you can study that on your own in more detail. Now we're moving to the next one, the command to leave. That's at the bottom section of page 2, the command to leave. Now this is what I touched on last week as I prepared to get you ready for this class in a way. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, the Lord God said to us on Horeb, "You stayed long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey and go." Now here's what I did here. I want you to notice that I found a similar story, also a command that God is telling them it's about time to leave. Also, we find that in Exodus chapter 32 and 33. But there's one major difference that stands out in the Exodus 32-33 account, and that is that there's going to be an angel that goes with them. Now, Deuteronomy doesn't mention an angel going with them. But you'll notice that I have an angel in Exodus 32, but also in Numbers chapter 20. Go with me there. Let's look at Numbers chapter 20 and verse 16. Numbers chapter 20. Verse 16, we cried to the Lord, to Jehovah, and he heard our plea, and he sent a messenger or an angel, a malach, who freed us from Egypt. Did an angel free him from Egypt? A malach? Well, according to Exodus, according to the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy doesn't mention that. Now, you might say, well, what are you suggesting here? I'm just showing you the difference. What you make of it is up to you. We'll be talking more about this as we work our way through these texts. Just make sure you understand that Deuteronomy doesn't mention the angel that redeemed them. That's only Exodus and Numbers. And the question becomes, why? You might say, well, Deuteronomy is just an abbreviated version of the story. You can't go into everything. So he just left out the angel that redeemed them. But anyway, so whatever you do with that, it's just an observation. Now look at page 3 in our chart. And I want to show you that there are some similarities between Exodus 33 and the account in Deuteronomy. And these are just verbal agreements, linguistic connections, and you can still argue that they're not the same event, but the chronology, the flow of the narrative seems to suggest to me that they may be. Notice about the middle of the page, Exodus 33:1, the Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt." Deuteronomy's version says, "Go in and take possession." Exodus 33, "To the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to your offspring I will give it." You see in Deuteronomy the connections there. Then Exodus 33 says, "I'm going to send the angel before you." I'll make the note again. See Numbers 20. Deuteronomy does not mention a Malach in the Exodus story. The departure from Horeb, which is where we presently are on my sheet, look at page 4. I want to single out Numbers chapter 10. In Numbers chapter 10, it says very plainly, in the second year, the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. Now, I put a note, the following gloss is an overview. It says, "And the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran." Now, we don't get to Paran yet. Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 and 12 are sort of giving you an overview. The cloud lifts from up over the testimony, and it leaves Horeb Sinai and settles over Paran. But oh, by the way, meanwhile, along the way to Paran, certain things happen. Now, one of those things is that Jethro is mentioned here. Look at verse 29, bottom of page 4 on my handout. Moses said to Hobab, the son of Ruel the Midianite. By the way, always check the Hebrew. They're trying to smooth over a difficulty here. Moses, his father-in-law. "We are setting out for the place of which Jehovah said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we'll do good to you, for Jehovah has promised good to Israel." But he said to him, "I'll not go. I will depart to my own land and to my kindred." And he said, "Please don't leave us, for you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you will serve as eyes for us. And if you do go with us, whatever good the Lord or Jehovah will do to us, the same we do to you." So he's asking Jethro, Ruel, Hobab to stay with him and to be the eyes for the children of Israel. Why is that? Because the Midianites know the desert, right? They're travelers, they're caravanners, they're like Bedouin, if you will. We see them early in Genesis where they're bringing goods and from the area of Dothan, and they carry, at least according to some part of the story, they are the ones who carry Joseph into Egypt. Of course, there's a debate. Is it the Midianites or the Ishmaelites or the Medanites? It's kind of confusing because we have different sources brought together in the same text. But the idea here is that Moses asked his father-in-law to stay with them and help guide them in the wilderness. Now, is this a lack of faith on Moses' part? Does he not know that God is going to guide them or that they're guided by the cloud? It's a very interesting question, but what we have here is it's a very realistic view of being in the wilderness. You would naturally ask the people of the desert, "Hey, look, I know you're familiar with these parts. Could you maybe go with us and help guide us?" So I love this source. And by the way, it's the only source that has this. Exodus doesn't tell us about this conversation, though Exodus does have Jethro at Horeb Sinai, and it does tell us that he leaves. And we're going to see that in just a minute. But it doesn't have the story in Exodus nor in Deuteronomy where he's asked by Moses to stick around and help guide him. So now we get to when we work through the command to leave and the departure from Horeb, we next go to a section that I call Missing Egypt's Food. Missing Egypt's Food. Now, we're all familiar. Now, by the way, notice that I've left chapter 10 of the book of Numbers, and now I'm following the natural order and arrangement of the text of Bamidbar. And the next thing we get to in chapter 11, you get the old complaining Israelites. And what are they griping about now? Well, part of the problem is that they're craving the food. How many of you have ever craved food? They're craving the food that they had in Egypt. And particularly at the bottom of the middle column on page 5, you'll look in verse 11, Numbers 11:4. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. Call it the Rebel Craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." Boy, they got their mouth watering thinking about that good old fish from Egypt. Now, the interesting thing is that I was looking for stories related to the complaint of missing food. When I first saw Exodus 16 and I put that tentatively in my chart, I thought, now wait a minute, I think this occurs earlier, so that doesn't fit. But then I began to notice how other stories lined up chronologically, the order and arrangement from Exodus 16, 17, 18, 19 seems to be in line with what we find in Numbers chapter 10 and 11, as I will make clear. So Exodus 16, verse 1, I'm still on page 5 of my sheet. It gives you sort of where they are, which would lead you to think this happens a little bit earlier. But then you get to verse 3, the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Again, my first thought was totally different story. One mentions specifically the fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks. This just says, man, we miss those big meat pots. But then turn the page. Look at page 6. Page 6 of my handout is called About the Manna. Now here in Exodus chapter 16, we're dealing with manna over and over and over. Exodus 16 mentions the manna in great detail. Now, by the way, Exodus 16 is not chronologically in the right place. How in the world could I say something with such confidence? Because it's not. If you read it closely, if it's chronological, Exodus 16 in this detailed description of the manna, it's presented as occurring before the story occurs chronologically. It appears before the revelation at Sinai and Horeb. Now, let me just go through a couple of the details. You read this more fully on your own after we log off today. The children of Israel, let's see, he's heard their grumbling. And then it begins to describe about Moses says, I'm about to make it rain from heaven, rain bread from heaven. And then they're supposed to go out and get a daily portion. But they can't get it on the Sabbath. They have to get extra the day before. And this is teaching them a valuable lesson about the Sabbath day. We're going to see this as we continue to work through. By the way, the revelation of Sinai hasn't happened yet, so they don't know about the Sabbath, at least in terms of the Decalogue yet. You might say, well, they knew about the Sabbath all the way in the beginning because God rested on the Sabbath day. But as an introduction to keeping the Sabbath, Exodus 16 is absolutely the beginning. Now, turn to page 7 in my handout. 7 in my handout, the people are still grumbling and, say to them, verse 12, top left, I've heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you'll be filled with bread. Then you'll know that I'm Jehovah your God. Now look in the middle column. I've continued to follow chapter 11 of Numbers, and it says, now our strength is dried up and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. So we have a connection with the manna story, and then we get sort of an interruption, if you will. You get an interruption with the story of the quail. You see this? You follow through 11. Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you'll eat meat because you've wept in the hearing of Jehovah. Who will give the meat to eat? It was better for us in Egypt. And then the Lord is going to give them a full dose of it. Verse 19. You shall not eat just 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you've rejected Jehovah who's among you and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? Look, they're about to get some quail. You want quail? They're going to get some quail. So then Moses is complaining. Well, you can go through that again on your own. Now, as you work through, go to page 8. I want to show you another part of similarity here. Notice the left-hand column, Exodus 16. This is in the manna story. And then all of a sudden, verse 13 says, in the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. Now, it doesn't give a lot of detail about the quail. You might suggest that it's another quail story, that maybe God sent quail in the camp twice. Look at the middle column. Numbers 11:31. A wind from Jehovah sprang up, and it brought quail from the sea and let them fall beside the camp. And it goes on. And remember, the story, you can just work through all the details there. What I'm proposing, and this will become more evident, is that the order of an arrangement of material, manna, in other words, Exodus, Numbers, manna, quail, manna, it picks back up with the manna story again. Now look at page 9 of my handout. It goes into detail. Verse 14, when the dew had gone up, this is from Exodus 16, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground, fine as frog hair, as we say here in the South. And when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? Manna, for they did not know what it was. And then Moses said to them, it's the bread that Jehovah has given you to eat. Then you go into the whole story about the Sabbath. All right, you work your way down. Now, page 10, I want you to look at the last entry. This is from Exodus 16, verse 32. Moses said, this is what Jehovah has commanded. Let an omer be kept of it throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Moses says to Aaron in chapter 16, verse 33, take a jar and put an omer of manna in it and place it before Jehovah to be kept throughout your generations. Verse 34, as the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. Guess what? There ain't no testimony in chapter 16. There's not a testimony yet. The testimony is going to come later. The testimony is a designation for the 10 words on 2 stone tablets. So Aaron in chapter 16 could not have at that time put the manna in the jar, put the jar of manna before the testimony, because there is no testimony yet. That means, very easy to deduce this, that this was written at the earliest after they had a testimony to put the jar of manna before. It was then obviously put in the text later. Now, verse 35, let's keep going on this. The people of Israel ate manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah. Now, let me ask you this. Why is it that Exodus 16 is talking about they ate it for 40 years when they hadn't been there 40 years yet? Why is Exodus 16 telling me that they ate the manna until they came to the the promised land, when that's a long way off? I'm just showing you that this part of the story is written later. Let me tell you how late. This narrative cannot be written earlier than them coming to the land. I'm not making this up. It's just simple. When you look at it, we just have to observe it. Now, you'll notice on the right-hand side of page 11 of my document that Deuteronomy also mentions the manna in chapter 8, verses 3 through 16, but that's outside of the scope of my class. But in my master document, I pulled in all of these references so that you can look at more and more side by side. This is just for a specific point here. Okay, now, by the way, one final point on the manna. Joshua 5:12 is the description of when they moved into the land and the manna stops. You can see that at Joshua 5:12. So at the earliest date, maybe when Joshua 5:12 takes place, maybe then Exodus 16 is put into the book, okay? Burden of leadership. Everybody knows that Moses is taught a tough lesson. He has to survive on the burden of leadership, on delegation. Moses is trying to carry too much. He says, look, this is too great. This people is too great. Now, we have 3 stories in the Pentateuch, which some might argue don't evince the same event, but I think it's worth a look. So I put them together just for your careful study. Notice in the left-hand column, which is Exodus, Jethro's advice. Jethro in chapter 18 of Exodus notices the burden. Now, by the way, I want you to notice how I'm following the sequence of events. Exodus 16 talks about manna and quail. Numbers chapter 11 talks about manna and quail. Exodus 18 talks about the burden of leadership. Numbers 11 talks about the burden of leadership. And Deuteronomy chapter 1 talks about the burden of leadership. All of these talk about the burden of leadership after manna and quail, except Deuteronomy doesn't mention quail, but otherwise. You see, what I'm trying to show is that the order and arrangement matches, as well as the similarity of the stories, which puts them on my chart. Now, you know the story. If we ran through Exodus chapter 18, you would see a certain thing. If you run through Numbers chapter 11, you'll see a certain thing. And if you run through Deuteronomy 1, you'll see something different. 3 stories about the burden of leadership. Now look at the middle of page 12 of my handout. On the left in the book of Exodus, Jethro says, you and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You know, the thing. You are not able to do it alone. Now obey my voice, I'll give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. You shall warn them about the statutes and the laws and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. Interesting, okay? So this is Jethro. Jethro sees Moses out there and he says, Moses, what are you doing? I couldn't help but see you out there with a line a mile long with people coming to you. And he said, well, this is the way I do it. I take the cases of the people and I adjudicate, and Jethro says, that's not going to work. It's not sustainable. You have to do something different. Okay? He says, let's go look at page 13. You'll notice in the left-hand column it says chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Now over in the right-hand column, you have a similar thing, commanders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens. Okay, go back to page 12. I want to show you that both of these result in the selection of people over the thousands, the hundreds, the fifties, and the tens. The book of Exodus, the idea is Jethro's. It's Jethro's idea. Jethro sees Moses. He knows the burden is too much. He knows it's not sustainable. He comes up with this plan. You need to pick these people, etc. Now look at page 12 of my handout, Deuteronomy 1:9. And this is Moses speaking first person. At that time I said to you, I'm not able to bear you by myself. Jehovah your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. May Jehovah, the God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times as many as you are, and bless you as he promised you. How can I bear myself the weight and burden of you and your strife? Choose for yourself tribes, wise, understanding, experienced men, and I will appoint them as your heads. And you answered, the thing that you have spoken is good for us to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, the wise, experienced men, and set them as heads over you. Now, the main point I want to bring out is he makes no mention of Jethro in this process. Doesn't mean that he doesn't know that Jethro told him about it and he just doesn't bring it up. But it is interesting that in the book of Exodus, clearly it's all about Jethro. Deuteronomy does not even mention Jethro in this particular context. Question becomes, is it the same story? And by the way, the book of Numbers gives a different account of the burden of leadership in this story in Numbers chapter 11, which chronologically aligns itself with Exodus 18 and Deuteronomy 1. It does align itself with the spreading out of the responsibility. But in the book of Numbers, as one might expect who studies these books closely, it's the spirit which is placed on the elders which enables them, these wise and understanding men, to be rulers. But again, you can look at that on your own and really study that. The question becomes, is this describing the same event? Jethro advising Moses, Moses having this idea of on his own, the Spirit on it. Are these the same event or are they different? Did perhaps Moses not once but twice choose or have chosen people that were over the thousands, the hundreds, the fifties, and the tens for the same reason? Would he have done that twice, or is it the same story? Therefore, it's the same story. Therefore, you can look at these and see what the differences are. And I think that's important to pay attention to. And now, look at page 14 on my handout, verse 24 of Exodus 18. Hopefully you're all following this chart. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he said. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they judged the people at all times. Any hard case they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided for themselves. Now keep reading. Next verse, verse 27. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went away to his own country. Now I bring another passage from this area in the book of Numbers. I bring to show you one more time, Numbers chapter 10, verse 29, which shows when the father-in-law departs. Now, it's interesting that this all is from the same section of text. This Numbers chapter 10, it's about the time they leave. There are these other stories, and then Exodus 18 aligns itself with that very text. Now we get to the spy narrative. And I'm going to put spies in air quotes. We have two accounts of the spies narrative. The first one is in Numbers chapter 13 and 14, and the other account of the spies is in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 19 through 40. Now, Numbers, the account in Numbers is much more detailed, as you'll see. It takes two whole chapters, whereas Deuteronomy gives us the basics of the story in just a few verses, like 21 verses, I think. But when you compare Deuteronomy 1 with Numbers 13 and 14, the order of the story, even though one contains more detail than the other, the order of the story is not messed up. You can follow Deuteronomy 1, you can follow Numbers 13, 14, same order and sequence of events. Now, as we work through this, though, we see some interesting things. Look at middle of page 15, the spies narrative. All right, Deuteronomy 1:19. See that in the right-hand column? Work with me. Then we set out from Horeb, and we went through all that great and terrifying wilderness that you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, as Jehovah our God commanded us. And we came to Kadesh Barnea. And I said to you, you've come to the hill country of the Amorites, which Jehovah our God is giving us. See, Jehovah your God has set the land before you. Go up, take possession as Jehovah the God of your fathers has told you. Don't fear or be dismayed. Verse 22. Then all of you came near to me and said, let us send men before us that they may explore the land for us. Simple enough. They're on the way. Moses is telling the story, first person. He says, we get to this place, I tell you to go up and take possession, and then y'all, all of you, people of Israel, came to me, Moses, and said, let us send men before us. Well, Numbers has a spy narrative too. In the spy narrative of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each of the tribe fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them, and it goes on, gives you a lot of detail. The question becomes, whose idea was it to send the spies? Does it matter? Some would say, well, maybe it was God's idea and then the people came forward, or the people came forward and then God said, hey, I like that. But the idea that I want to show you is that we have two different accounts of the spy narrative. Now, flip through the pages. Look at verse 16, page 16 of my document. This is coming from chapter 17 of the book of Numbers. Numbers 13, 17. Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up into the Negev and go up into the hill country and see what the land is, whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, etc. Now look over in the Deuteronomy column. There it is. It says, bring us word again of the way by which we must go and the cities into which we shall come. So wording is different, you see, but the idea is the same. Whoever's idea it was to send the spies, they have a task. That's consistent between our sources. The task is simple. Go in, spy out the land, see what kind of people, etc., etc. All right. Page 17 of my document, just to show you the correlation between the two. Look at middle ways on page 17. In Numbers 13, it says, and they came to the valley of Eshcol. Look at right next to it. And came to the valley of Eshcol. Look down on the middle column again, still verse 23 of Numbers chapter 13. And they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between two of them. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. Now, how does Deuteronomy record that? And they took in their hands some of the fruit of the land and brought it down to us. Numbers is just more specific. They had this big thing of grapes, and they had this post, and they put the grapes over it. You've seen the picture. It's beautiful. That's what they did. And Deuteronomy just said, yeah, they brought some fruit. All right? Anyway, as you go through, and I encourage you to go through this, you're going to see that Numbers gives us a lot of detail. Deuteronomy is not so much. Page 19 of my handout. Notice the middle of the page, a little to the bottom of that. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel, and Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and said to all the congregation of the people, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceeding good land. All Deuteronomy tells is, and they brought us word again and said it's a good land that the Lord our God is giving us. You can work through. You'll see over and over the similarities as well as the differences. Now look at page 22. See where it says Numbers chapter 14, 20. And the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. This is after he intercedes on behalf of Israel. But, this is Jehovah, truly as I live and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of Jehovah, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give their fathers. And none of those who despise me shall see it, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. In this, you'll see the Deuteronomy column and how it corresponds, where it does and does not have what Numbers 13 and 14 have. Page 23 shows you where Deuteronomy brings in Joshua and the little ones. So there are some very consistent points between these stories. Clearly, Numbers 13 and 14 and Deuteronomy chapter 1 towards the end of the chapter deal with this spy thing, right? What I want you to do is to begin to open up your mind to the possibility that there are more cases of these opportunities to look synoptically at the text and stories of the Pentateuch. I want to encourage you to carefully study this document. I breezed through it, only brought up a few points here and there. It is a work in progress. I welcome critique and correction. So in other words, if you find something in here that you think, oh, this is, you need to correct this, please send it to me. I want people to point out errors, mistakes, because that helps me to learn. So if you see anything or you think of ways to make this better, a more valuable tool, let me know. But I hope that this has been helpful and informative. And next week, we will continue our wilderness wanderings with the children of Israel. And you notice on my chart, I have the battle with Amalek. Maybe the battle with Amalek is told in different books of the Bible. Maybe if we look at the battle with Amalek, we can discern some interesting and informative facts about that battle. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Join me next week. Same time, same channel. Have a beautiful week.